The morning Ida Thatcher pulled her grandmother's ring from her finger, her hands were shaking so badly, she nearly dropped it twice into the red Kansas dust. It was the spring of 1873, and the territory was dry as old bone, the kind of dry that cracked lips and cracked earth and cracked the spirits of even the most stubborn homesteaders who had staked their dreams on the rolling plains west of Dodge City. Ida had been on her land for 3 years now, alone for the last 8 months of that stretch, ever since her husband Roy had gone to gather timber from a stand of cottonwoods near the creek and never come home. They found him 2 days later, the horse spooked and fled, Roy with a broken neck at the base of a shallow ravine. He had been 29 years old. Ida had been 26. Now she was 27, and the weight of a farm, 2 milk cows, a mule named Patience, and 6 acres of struggling winter wheat rested entirely on her narrow shoulders. The wheat had come up thin that spring, thinner than she had expected and thinner than she could afford. The real problem, the problem that had kept her awake through 3 cold nights in a row, was the feed situation. She had miscalculated badly through the winter, trading off more of her stored grain than she should have when the prices had briefly spiked in January. Now April sat heavy on the plains, the grass still too sparse and yellow for the animals to sustain themselves on pasture alone, and her feed stores were down to almost nothing. She had maybe 4 days left for the cows and the mule before they would begin to suffer, and suffering animals on a one-woman homestead meant the difference between barely surviving and losing everything entirely. She had ridden into the town of Millhaven that morning on Patience's broad back, sitting stiff and straight in the saddle the way Roy had taught her, eyes forward, chin up. Millhaven was not much of a town. It had a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Red Sage that smelled of sour whiskey even at 8 in the morning, a small post office wedged between 2 empty lots, and a feed and grain merchant named Gerald Stout who operated out of a wide low building near the edge of town. Stout was a heavy-set man with small eyes and surprisingly delicate hands, the kind of man who was polite on the surface but calculated everything down to the last cent behind those small eyes. Ida had arrived at Stout's with exactly 63 cents in her coin purse, which she knew was not enough. A 50-pound sack of mixed grain cost 90 cents. She needed at least 3 sacks to get her animals through to the point where the spring grass would carry them. She had no credit with Stout. She had applied for it in February, and he had declined, citing her status as a widow with no male guarantor on the property. She had not argued at the time because she had thought she still had enough feed to manage. That had been her mistake. Standing in the dim cool of Stout's warehouse, with the smell of grain dust and burlap in her nose, Ida had looked at her options and found them all locked doors. She could not borrow. She had nothing sellable that she could spare and still run the farm, nothing except the ring. She had taken it off right there, standing in front of Gerald Stout with her jaw set hard. It was a slim gold band with a small oval garnet set in a simple claw mount, the kind of piece a working woman wore rather than a lady of fashion, but it was the most beautiful object Ida had ever owned. Her grandmother, Ida Thatcher, had come west from Ohio 40 years before, had buried a son and a husband on the frontier, and had kept that ring through all of it. She had pressed it into Ida's hand on her deathbed 12 years ago, when Ida had been only 15, and told her to keep it close because gold remembered where it had been worn. Ida set the ring on the wooden counter in front of Gerald Stout and said simply that she needed 3 sacks of mixed grain and whatever credit the ring would buy against future supplies. Stout had examined it with his delicate fingers, turning it in the light, and had said it was worth perhaps $1.25, which was generous of him, he said, because it was small and the garnet was not particularly fine. He would give her 3 sacks and a credit note of 40 cents against future purchases. It was not a good trade. Ida knew it was not a good trade. She took it anyway because the animals could not wait and because she had no other card to play. She had loaded the 3 sacks onto Patience with the help of Stout's young assistant, a boy of about 14 who looked at her with eyes full of the particular sympathy that people reserved for widows. And she had ridden out of Millhaven trying very hard not to think about her grandmother's hands, and the way Alina had always turned that ring when she was thinking hard about something difficult. She was about 1.5 miles out of town, moving along the rutted wagon track that cut northwest toward her homestead, when she heard hoofbeats coming up fast behind her. She turned in the saddle with the instinctive alertness of a woman who had lived alone on the frontier for 8 months, and saw a rider coming up the road at a solid lope. He was riding a dark bay horse, a well-built animal that moved with the easy confidence of a horse that had covered a lot of country. The man on it was tall in the saddle, wearing a plain brown canvas coat despite the growing warmth of the morning, a battered hat pulled low, and he was holding something up in his right hand as he rode, something small, something that caught the light. He pulled up alongside Patience, and the bay horse flicked his ears politely at the mule and settled without being asked. The man pushed his hat back from his forehead and looked at Ida directly, and she saw that he was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two older, with a brown, weathered face and dark eyes that were steady without being hard. He had a jaw that needed shaving and a small scar at the corner of his left eyebrow that made him look like he had once asked the wrong question of the wrong man. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and plain, "I believe you left something at Stout's." He opened his hand, and there was her grandmother's ring sitting in his palm, the garnet catching a thin red fire in the morning sun. Ida stared at it. Her throat closed entirely. "I was coming in to buy grain when you were loading up," he said. "I saw the ring on the counter. Stout had set it aside in his cash box. I asked him what it was, and he told me a widow woman had traded it for feed this morning." He paused, something moving behind his eyes. "I bought it back from him, $1.50. He was not eager to sell it, but he came around." "You bought it," Ida said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin and careful. "Yes, ma'am. Why would you do that?" He seemed to consider this question, as if it were a reasonable one that deserved a real answer, rather than brushing it off. "Because a woman should not have to give up something like that for feed grain," he said. "It is not right." Ida looked at the ring in his open hand and then looked at his face, and she could not find anything in that face that suggested calculation or expectation of anything in return. She had encountered enough men in her months of solitary widowhood to know the difference between a man who did something for a woman because he wanted a return on his investment, and a man who did something because he simply thought it was the right thing to do. This man appeared to be the latter kind, which was rare enough that she did not quite know what to do with it. "I cannot pay you back," she said, because she believed in being direct. "I spent what I had, and that ring was the rest of it." "I am not asking you to pay me back," he said. He held the ring out to her. She hesitated one more moment and then took it from his hand. The gold was warm from his palm, and it slid back onto her finger as if it had never been away, and she felt something in her chest unlock that she had not fully noticed was locked. "Thank you," she said. It felt inadequate by a wide margin. "Homer Ashford," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I run cattle over near the Bridle Creek Range about 6 miles east of here." "Ida Thatcher," she said. "I have a homestead up the Northwest Road, the Wheat Place." He nodded as if he already knew the landscape well enough to picture it. "Your wheat looked thin coming up last week when I rode past that road." "It is thin," she agreed, "but it is coming." He looked at her for a moment with those steady dark eyes, and she had the odd sensation of being seen clearly without being judged for what was found there. It was not an entirely comfortable feeling because she was not accustomed to it. Roy had loved her, she knew that, but Roy had never quite looked at her the way this stranger was looking at her, as if she were something that warranted a serious and respectful attention. "Well, Mrs. Thatcher," Homer said, "I hope your animals do well on the grain and your wheat comes up strong." "Thank you, Mr. Ashford," she said, "and thank you for this." She touched the ring briefly. He nodded once more, pulled his hat forward, and turned his bay horse back toward Millhaven at an easy walk. Ida watched him go for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she touched Patience's sides and headed for home. She thought about him on the ride back. She could not help it. She thought about the deliberateness of it, riding out after her before she had gotten too far, the ring already repurchased. He had done it quickly, which meant he had decided quickly, which meant the decision had not required a great deal of internal debate. That said something about the kind of man he was. She turned the ring on her finger once and felt her grandmother's presence close and warm, like a hand on her shoulder. The homestead, when she came around the last low swell of ground and saw it, looked the same as it always did, small and stubborn against the wide sky. The house was a one-room soddy with a plank floor that Roy had laid himself, and beside it a lean-to barn that was in constant need of some repair or other, and beyond that the 6 acres of winter wheat coming up green-gray in the April light. It was not much. It was hers. She fed the animals that evening with careful measured handfuls of the new grain, talking to the cows the way she always did, telling them that things were going to be fine even though she was not entirely certain they were. The mule Patience ate her portion with dignified appreciation and allowed Ida to scratch between her long ears without pulling away. That night Ida sat at her small table with her lamp and her ledger and tried to see a path forward through the numbers. The ledger was honest and the honesty was brutal. The wheat, if it came in well, would bring her enough to carry into the summer and perhaps put a little aside. But if it came in thin, she would be in a harder position than ever by fall. There was no husband's wage coming in, no family nearby she could lean on. Her only sister lived in Missouri, married to a schoolteacher, and they exchanged letters twice a year with the careful cheerfulness of people who knew they could not help each other and were sorry about it. She thought about Homer Ashford riding up the road with the ring held up in the sun. She thought about his voice, plain and serious, saying it was not right for a woman to give up something like that for feed grain. She picked up her pen and wrote a letter to her sister, and at the end of it, after she had described the state of the wheat and the animals and the weather, she wrote, "Something unusual happened today, and I do not quite know what to make of it. A cowboy brought something back to me that I had already let go of, and I cannot stop thinking about what kind of man does that without any expectation of anything in return." She folded the letter and sealed it and set it on the corner of the table to mail the next time she went to town. In the morning she was up before the sun, the way she always was, because a one-woman farm demanded it. She lit the stove and made coffee and went out to see to the animals in the thin gray light, and she was halfway through the morning milking when she heard a horse coming up her road. She came out of the barn with her milk pail and squinted toward the road and saw Homer Ashford riding his bay horse along the wagon track at a steady walk. And behind the bay, he was leading a second horse carrying what looked like sacks of lumber planks tied across its back. She set the pail down carefully and walked to the fence gate. He pulled up and tipped his hat. "Morning, Mrs. Thatcher." "Mr. Ashford," she said. "This is a surprise. I noticed yesterday your barn linta has a section of the south wall that has come away from the post," he said, in a matter-of-fact tone as if this were information she had asked him for. "If it rains hard before you get it fixed, you will lose whatever you have stacked in that corner. I happen to have some extra planking I was not using." She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware that she was standing in her work dress with her hair braided for labor rather than pinned for company, with the smell of milk on her hands, and that she had not expected anyone to come calling at 6 in the morning. She was also aware that the south wall of the linta was exactly as he described, and that she had been putting off the repair for 2 weeks because she did not have a spare morning. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know that," he said mildly. "I am perfectly capable of doing the repair myself." "I have no doubt of that," he said, with complete sincerity. "But I have the morning and I have the lumber, and there is no reason to be difficult about a practical thing." It was such a reasonable statement, offered without any condescension or pity, that she found she did not have a reasonable counter to it. "All right," she said. "I will put some biscuits on." "You do not need to feed me," he said. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "if you are going to fix my barn wall, I am going to feed you. That is how it works." The corner of his mouth moved in what she was starting to understand was his version of a smile. "Yes, ma'am." He was a good worker, methodical and efficient, the kind of man who had done physical work long enough that he moved through it without wasted effort. He had the wall secured and replanked by the time she had biscuits and bacon on the table, and he came inside and washed his hands at the basin she set out, and sat down at her table with a care that she recognized as a man mindful of being in a woman's space, not making himself too large in it. She poured the coffee and sat across from him, and they ate together, with the morning light coming through the single window. And it was the first time in 8 months that Ida had eaten breakfast with another human being at that table. "How long have you been running cattle near Bridle Creek?" she asked, because she genuinely wanted to know. 3 years, he said. "I came out from Texas after I got tired of working other men's herds, saved enough to buy a small start, 50 head a good bull. They are up to nearly 90 now." "That is good progress," she said. "It is slow," he said without complaint, "but it is solid. I would rather build slowly on solid ground than fast on nothing." She understood that exactly. It was how she thought about her wheat. "Roy and I had the same idea," she said. She said Roy's name steadily, the way she had learned to, without the catch in her throat that had been there for the first several months. "We came out from Illinois 3 years ago. He was a good farmer, better than me honestly, but I am catching up." Homer looked at her. "From what I can see, you are doing all right." "I make mistakes," she said. "The grain situation was a mistake. I should have been more careful in January." "Everyone makes mistakes in January," he said. "The cold does something to the accounting." She laughed at that, a real laugh, sudden and a little startled, and she saw him look pleased by it in his quiet way. He left after breakfast with a tipped hat and a simple goodbye, and she stood in the doorway watching him ride away for the second time, and thinking that she was going to have to be very careful about what she was beginning to feel, because she was a practical woman and she could not afford to be impractical. He came back 4 days later, this time with a question rather than a task. He stopped at the gate and asked if she would mind if he rode the north edge of her property, because he was looking for a stray heifer and thought she might have drifted that way. Ida told him to go ahead and go, and he did, and he came back around the east side of the property an hour later with the heifer on a rope and stopped again at the gate. "Found her in your north draw," he said. She had gotten her head stuck in a fence wire and worked herself free, but was not inclined to go back home. "Is she all right?" Ida asked. "Scraped up some, but fine." He paused. "Your north fence has a section that is down, about 20 yards. You might get my cattle and your wheat if we have a warm night." "I will fix it tomorrow," she said. "I can help," he offered. "You have cattle to tend," she said. "Billy can watch them," he said, which she took to mean he had a hired man, and she felt oddly relieved that she was not pulling him away from a complete absence of other responsibilities. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow morning." He arrived the next morning with fencing supplies, and Billy turned out to be a lean young Mexican vaquero of perhaps 22, who Homer introduced with easy respect. The kind of man who did not distinguish between his regard for a person based on where they had been born or what they looked like, which Ida noted and approved of in the silent way she approved of things that seemed important. Billy helped them with the fence line and then rode back toward the cattle range on his quick-footed little roan horse, and Ida and Homer walked back toward the homestead along the edge of the wheat field in the mild spring morning, and she realized that she was comfortable with him in a way that should have taken longer to develop. "Tell me about Texas," she said. He walked with his thumbs hooked in his belt, looking at the green wheat rows. "Hot," he said. "Loud. I liked it when I was younger. Seemed like the world was happening there, all that cattle moving north, the drives up the Kishom. I was on 4 drives before I came up here." "That is a hard life," she said. "It teaches you things," he said. "About men mostly, who holds together and who does not when things go badly." "And which kind were you?" He glanced at her sideways, a brief look that carried a weight of self-knowledge. "I held," he said simply. She believed him without hesitation. There was something structural about Homer Ashford, something that suggested he had been tested and had not broken, and that he knew the difference between bravery and recklessness because he had seen what recklessness cost. "My father would have liked you," she said, and was surprised by her own words. He looked at her. "What was he like?" "Stubborn," she said. "Fair." He believed a man should do what was right even when it cost him. She glanced at him. "Like buying back a stranger's ring for $1.50. "That is not the same thing," he said. "It is exactly the same thing," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the wheat, and then he said, "Your wheat is coming in better this week." "It is," she said. She noticed he had changed the subject, and she let him, because she was a woman who understood the value of letting a man have a moment's dignity. They reached the edge of the yard, and she asked if he would take water before he rode back, and he said yes. And they stood at the well pump in the morning light while she worked the handle and he held the tin cup. And she was aware of the smallness of the distance between them, the practical closeness of two people sharing a task. And she thought that this was how it started, the dangerous and wonderful business of caring about another person. He visited again the following week, this time with no task or pretext. He simply rode up the road and tipped his hat and asked if she wanted company for the evening, because he had happened to cook too much stew and thought she might want some of it. He had a covered pot on the pack saddle of his horse, and the smell coming from it made her stomach respond enthusiastically, because she had been eating simple and plain for so long that the idea of someone else's cooking felt like a luxury from another world. She invited him in, and he set the pot on her stove, and she made cornbread to go with it, and they ate together in the lamplight as the sun went down outside, and the prairie settled into its evening sounds, the wind dropping, the crickets taking over, the occasional soft complaint of one of the cows in the lean-to barn. He told her about Bridle Creek, about the way it ran quick and cold in spring and slowed to nearly nothing by August, and how he had built his cabin on a slight rise so he could see down the whole creek valley when the morning light was right. She told him about Illinois, about her father's farm where she had grown up, about the particular smell of Illinois spring that was different from Kansas spring, greener and wetter, with elm trees and white ash and grass that was almost blue-green in the right light. "Do you miss it?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "I miss the trees," she said, "and my father, he died 4 years ago. I miss having family close." She paused. "But I do not want to go back. This is my land. Roy and I chose it. Leaving it would be like saying that choice was wrong, and it was not wrong." He nodded slowly. "A choice does not have to work out perfectly to be the right choice," he said. "No," she agreed. "It does not." He left when the evening was full dark, lighting a small lantern on his saddle for the 6 miles back to Bridle Creek, and she stood in the doorway until the light disappeared over the first rise, and then stayed there a little longer in the warm dark, listening to the night. She wrote in her ledger that night, but she was not writing numbers. She was writing words, trying to get at something she did not quite have language for yet, the sensation of a world that had been gray and practical and solitary for 8 months beginning, slowly and tentatively, to develop color again. The following Saturday she rode into Millhaven for supplies and to mail her letter to her sister, and at the post office she found a small crate waiting for her with her name on it in a handwriting she did not recognize. She asked about it, and the postmaster, a thin man named Perkins, said a Mr. Ashford had left it for her 3 days ago. She opened it on the post office steps. Inside, packed in clean straw, were 6 young tomato seedlings in small clay pots, already green and sturdy-looking, and a folded piece of paper that said, in a careful hand, "The growing season is short up here, but not too short for tomatoes if you start them now." She sat on the post office steps in the Millhaven morning, holding the note and the crate, and felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with sorrow. She went to Stout's for her supplies, and Stout, who had clearly heard she was friendly with Homer Ashford because news moved in Millhaven the way water moved on a flat floor, was noticeably more pleasant to her than usual, extending her a small line of credit without her asking. She accepted it with a cool courtesy and did not thank him more than was due. On the ride home she passed two homesteads, the Kepler place and the Dahlin place, and the women at both came to their doors and waved, and she waved back, and she thought about how she had kept herself separate from the community of Millhaven women in the months since Roy died, not out of grief exactly, but out of the particular pride of a woman who does not want to be seen struggling. She thought she might do better at that. She thought about the tomato seedlings and how Homer had thought of them not as a grand gesture but as a practical one, something useful, something that would produce food, and she thought that was the best kind of gift, the kind that said, I see what your life actually is, and I want to make it better in real terms. She planted the seedlings the next morning in the south-facing patch beside the house where the sun was longest, and she talked to them the way she talked to the cows, promising them decent care and sufficient water. Homer came by 3 days later and saw them and said nothing about the seedlings, but she saw him look at them and register that they were planted and doing well, and the look on his face was private and warm in a way that she was not sure he realized was showing. "Mr. Ashford," she said, because she had been thinking about it, "I want to ask you something direct." "Yes, ma'am," he said. He stood at the garden fence, hat in his hands now. "What is it that you are doing?" she asked. "Coming by here." "The lumber, the fence wire, the seedlings. What is this?" He met her eyes without evasion. "I think you already know what it is," he said. "I want to hear you say it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, turning the hat brim through his fingers. "I think about you," he said, "more than I think about most things, which is saying something because I generally think about my cattle a good deal." The corner of his mouth moved. "I would like to call on you properly if that is something you would permit, not sneaking around it with fence repairs, calling on you." She looked at him for a long moment, this serious, quiet, decent man with the weathered face and the steady eyes, this man who had ridden up a road with her grandmother's ring held up in the sun, because he thought it was not right for a woman to have to give that up. "I would permit that," she said. He nodded once as if they had concluded a business negotiation, which they partly had. Then he said, "Are you free Sunday afternoon?" "I am," she said. "I will come at 2, he said. "If that suits you." "It suits me," she said. He came at 2 on Sunday, cleaned up and wearing a pressed shirt, his jaw finally properly shaved so she could see the full line of it, which was a good line, strong without being heavy. He brought her a small jar of wild honey he had found in a hollow tree near the creek, wrapped in a piece of linen cloth tied with a bit of cord. It was such a simple thing, and she found it so thoroughly charming that she had to look away for a moment while she set it on the table. They sat on the 2 chairs, she moved to the yard in the spring sunshine, and talked for 2 hours without any effort at all. He asked her about her wheat rotation plan, and she told him, and he made one suggestion about fallow fields that was actually quite good, and she told him so. She asked him about his expansion plans for the cattle herd, and he told her about the grazing land to the north that he was hoping to lease access to. And she asked the right questions because she had grown up around farming and could think about land use intelligently. And she saw that he was pleased by this, not in a condescending way, but in the way of a man who has found someone to actually talk to. When the shadows started going long, he stood to leave, and she walked with him to where the bay horse was tied at the gate. He stood with his hand on the horse's neck and looked at her in the golden late afternoon light and said, "Thank you, Ida." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it went through her like a warm current. "Thank you, Homer," she said back, deliberately, watching his face when she said it. Something shifted in his expression, something opened, and then he pulled it back to careful and settled his hat on his head. "Next Sunday," he said. "Next Sunday," she agreed. That evening she took out her grandmother's ring and held it up in the lamplight and looked at the garnet catching red in the flame. and she thought about Ida Thatcher crossing into Kansas territory 40 years before, young and brave and impractical enough to keep a gold ring through everything that tried to take it from her. Ida put the ring back on her finger and went to bed with a strange lightness in her chest that she recognized, after some consideration, as happiness. The Sundays became a reliable thing, and then Homer began coming on Wednesdays as well. And sometimes on a random Thursday or Friday, he would ride by and tie his horse at the gate and help her with whatever needed doing, not because she had asked, and not because she could not do it alone, but because they were both coming to understand that doing things together was better than doing them separately, not only more efficient but genuinely more pleasant. Billy the vaquero came by in mid-May to deliver a message from Homer that he would be a day late for their Wednesday visit because of a situation with the leasing of the northern grazing land, and Billy stayed long enough to drink a cup of coffee and tell her that Homer was the best man he had ever worked for, said without any fanfare, as plain fact. Ida asked him how long he had worked for Homer, and Billy said 3 years, since before Homer had his own place, and that Homer was the first ranch man he had worked for who paid fairly and on time, and did not look at him sideways for being Mexican. That afternoon, after Billy left, Ida thought about the ways Homer moved through the world, the easy fairness he extended without making a production of it. She thought about the way he listened to her without waiting for his turn to talk, the way he argued with her when he disagreed instead of letting her be right to avoid discomfort, the way he looked at her land and her animals and her plans with a kind of respect that she had only rarely encountered from any man. She was in love with him. She recognized it the way you recognize the smell of rain before it arrived. There was no dramatic revelation, just a quiet certain knowledge that settled into place and refused to be moved. Homer came on Thursday instead of Wednesday, apologizing for the delay, and she made him sit down and told him she had something to say to him. He sat across the table with his hat on his knee and his face alert, and she said, "I think I am in love with you, Homer Ashford, and I thought you should know that directly." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. He looked at her across the table and then looked at his hat and then looked back at her, and she could see him working through whatever was happening in him. "Ida," he said, and then stopped and started again. "I have been trying to find the right moment to tell you the same thing, and I was not finding it, so I am glad you said it first." "Are you saying you love me?" she said, because she was a woman who required clarity. "Yes," he said, directly and without decoration. "I am saying exactly that." She let out a breath she had not quite known she was holding and then smiled at him, a real full smile, the kind she had not managed in a very long time, and he looked at it as if it were something remarkable, something he wanted to hold on to. He reached across the table and took her hand, the hand with the garnet ring, and held it in both of his with a steadiness that she felt all the way up her arm and into her chest. "I want to do this properly," he said. "I want to court you properly and let it grow the right way. I do not want to rush you." "I am already there," she said. "You do not need to worry about rushing me." "I know," he said, "but I want to do it right anyway. You deserve that." She turned her hand over and held his back and thought that this man, this quiet, serious, careful man, was quite possibly the most genuinely good person she had ever encountered, and that the world was a remarkable place, because he had ridden up a road with her grandmother's ring held out in the April sun, and that small, impulsive, decent act had brought them here to this moment. May turned to June, and the wheat came on strong, stronger than she had dared hope in the thin days of April. She rode out on Patience to check the crop every few days, and each time the rows were fuller and greener, the heads coming up with that particular urgency that good grain had in a good year. She wrote to her sister Margaret in Missouri and told her that the wheat was coming in well and that she had met a man, a good man, a cattleman named Homer Ashford, and that she thought Margaret would like him if she ever met him. Margaret wrote back in 3 weeks and said she was very glad about the wheat and very curious about the cattleman, and asked whether Ida was considering anything permanent, to which Ida wrote back that it was still early days but that she was not ruling anything out. Homer met the Kepler family from the neighboring homestead in June, when they all coincidentally arrived at the Millhaven General Store at the same time. Hermann Kepler was a stocky German-born farmer with a large family and a good-natured laugh, and his wife Agnes was small and quick-eyed, and had already clearly made up her mind about Homer based on what she had heard in the way that small-town women formed opinions, which was thoroughly and irrevocably. She shook Homer's hand with great approval and told him that Ida Thatcher was the most capable woman in the territory, and that whoever had the sense to appreciate that fact was a man worth knowing. Homer said he was entirely in agreement, which Agnes approved of as well. Walking back to their horses after, Ida said, "She likes you." "She likes that I like you," Homer corrected. "Is there a difference?" He smiled at her, a fuller smile than usual, one that reached his eyes. "No," he said, "I suppose there is not." He kissed her for the first time that evening, leaning against the fence gate in the summer dusk, with the first fireflies just beginning to emerge from the grass. And it was a careful, serious, warm kiss, the kind that asked a question rather than demanded an answer. And she answered it without hesitation by leaning into it and putting her free hand against his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. When they separated, he touched the side of her face briefly with his rough hand and looked at her in the fading light with an expression of such open and unguarded feeling that she thought she would carry that look with her for the rest of her life regardless of what happened. "You know what I am going to ask you," he said. "I know," she said. "Not yet," he said. "I want to wait until after the harvest. I want you to have the harvest behind you, your first harvest alone, so that when I ask you, it is not because you need help but because you want this." She understood what he was saying, and she loved him more for it, because it recognized something important about who she was, a woman who needed to know she could do it herself before she chose to do it with someone else. "All right," she said, "after the harvest." The summer was long and hot and alive with work and small pleasures. She worked her wheat in her garden, which was producing tomatoes now, deep red and satisfying in the summer heat, the plants robust and healthy in their south-facing patch. She traded half of her tomato surplus to Agnes Kepler for preserved peaches and some extra flour, which was the kind of sensible neighboring that made frontier life survivable. She and Agnes developed a friendship over the summer, the careful, practical friendship of two busy women who valued each other's competence, and it was a good thing to have. Homer worked his cattle range, and the northern grazing lease came through in July, giving him access to good summer pasture that let him keep the herd fed without depleting his own land. Billy reported this with quiet satisfaction, and Homer took the news with his usual measured pleasure, as if good things were expected but still appreciated when they arrived. They spent Sunday afternoons together through July and August, sometimes at her place, and sometimes he would ride with her to Bridle Creek, and she would see his cabin for the first time, a solid square-built log structure with a proper stone fireplace and a wide porch that looked down the creek valley exactly as he had described. She stood on that porch in the August afternoon light and saw what he had seen when he chose this place, the way the light moved down the valley in the late day, the way the creek caught it in long silver ribbons, the way the land opened out beyond to the rolling miles of the Kansas range. "It is beautiful," she said, and she was not only talking about the view. "It is better with someone in it," he said, and he was not only talking about the view either. They had their arguments too, because people who talk honestly and have opinions inevitably do, and they were good arguments in the sense that neither of them resorted to cruelty or silence. They argued about whether Ida should plant a second field of wheat in the fall or diversify into something else, Homer suggesting sunflowers for oil production as a second crop, and Ida initially resistant, and then coming around to the logic of it over the course of a week. They argued about a steer that had gotten into her north field and done some damage, because it was one of Homer's strays, and she was direct about the cost of the damage, and he was direct about making it right, and it was settled in 20 minutes with complete fairness, and neither of them carrying any residue of bad feeling afterward. She liked that. She liked that they could disagree and come back to each other clean. The wheat harvest came in the first week of September, and it was a good harvest, better than any she had hoped for in April when she had stood in Gerald Stout's warehouse and put her grandmother's ring on the counter. The yield per acre was not extraordinary, but it was solid and it was honest, the product of good soil management and the rain that had come reliably through June and July. And when she had it threshed and weighed and sold, she had enough to cover her expenses with a margin left over that was more than she had seen in her bank account since before Roy died. She sat with her ledger the night after the final sale and looked at the numbers and felt a deep and foundational satisfaction, not pride exactly, something quieter and more durable than pride. She had done it. She had taken a farm in crisis and brought it through. She had made every decision herself, had managed the land and the animals and the money and the repairs, had gotten through the loneliness and the grief and the exhausted mornings and the worried nights, and here she was on the other side with a positive ledger and tomatoes still on the vine and a solid north fence and a barn wall that was not going to let the rain in. She looked at the garnet ring on her finger. "There, Grandma Alina," she said softly. "How is that?" Homer came by the next afternoon, and she showed him the ledger with only slight hesitation, because showing a man your ledger was an intimate thing, more intimate in some ways than a kiss, and he looked at it carefully and soberly, and then looked up at her with something in his face that was a cross between admiration and pure happiness. "That is a fine harvest for a single season on your own," he said. "It is," she agreed. He set the ledger on the table and stood up and took her hands in both of his, the way he had taken her hand that first time across the table in June. "Ida," he said, "the harvest is done." "It is," she said, with her heart going steady and fast at the same time. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "I know," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. He said it plain and direct, the way he said everything without stage business or dramatic kneeling, just the words and his steady dark eyes on hers and his hands holding hers with a strength that she trusted completely. "I love you. I want to build something with you. Not because you need my help, but because I believe what we could build together would be better than what either of us could build alone, and I think you know that is true too." She looked at him. She thought about April, about the shaking hands taking the ring off her finger, about the practical despair of the feed grain problem, and the long winter that had preceded it, and the 8 months alone, and the grief that she had carried in silence because there was no one to carry it with her. She thought about the day he rode up the road with the ring held up in the sun, not knowing her, having no claim on her, simply deciding that something was not right and fixing it. She thought about everything that had come after, the lumber and the fence wire and the tomato seedlings, the Sunday afternoons and the Wednesday visits and the conversations that went long past any scheduled end. The way he argued with her like an equal and listened to her like someone whose thoughts were worth attending to. The firefly evening at the gate, his hands on her face in the fading light. "Yes," she said, "Homer Ashford, I will marry you." He pulled her toward him with a care that still somehow managed to feel urgent, and she went into his arms, and the solidity of him was exactly what she had somehow known it would be. The arms of a man who had been tested and had not broken, holding her not because she was fragile but because he wanted to. They were married in November of 1873, on a clear cold day that smelled of frost and wood smoke, in the small white church that Millhaven had finished building in August. Agnes Kepler stood up with Ida and Billy stood up with Homer, which struck almost everyone who witnessed it as completely right. The minister was a round-faced man named Reverend Hatch, who performed the ceremony with a warm efficiency that made the brevity feel appropriate rather than rushed. Ida wore her best dress, the blue wool one she had made in the summer when she had finally allowed herself a few yards of good fabric, and her grandmother's ring, which she moved from her right hand to her left for the ceremony. Homer put a plain gold band on her finger beside it, and she looked down at the two rings together and thought about Alina, who had kept her ring through everything, and she understood now what her grandmother had meant about gold remembering. The Keplers put on a wedding supper at their place, which was larger than either of the newlyweds' homes, and people came from surrounding farms and homesteads, some of whom Ida barely knew, but who came anyway because a wedding in a frontier community was a collective event, a declaration that life was going forward. They danced in the Keplers' main room to fiddle music played by a lanky man named Sorrels who could play almost anything if you hummed him the tune first. And Homer danced badly and admitted it freely, and did not stop dancing anyway, which made Ida laugh until her eyes went bright. They settled into a life that was two farms running as one operation with two adults who were good at different things, and honest about which things those were. Ida knew wheat and soil and garden management and accounts, and Homer knew cattle and range and building and repair, and they overlapped enough to cover the gaps and differed enough to make the collaboration genuinely effective. Billy came to work the cattle range full-time with a small wage increase that Homer gave without being asked because the work merited it, and in the spring Ida hired an older woman named Ruth Greenway, who had come west with her family and then found herself stranded in Millhaven when her husband's business failed, giving her fair pay for help with the expanded garden and the second wheat field. The homestead grew. Not dramatically and not overnight, but steadily and practically, the way things grew when they were rooted in honest soil. Ida planted the sunflowers Homer had suggested, running a long, bright row of them along the north field edge where they would not shade the wheat. And in August, the field blazed gold in a way that she had not expected to move her as much as it did, and she stood at the edge of it with Homer's arm around her shoulders, and thought that this was what it felt like to have built something real. Their first child, a boy they named Ellis Roy Ashford, was born in September of 1874, 11 months into the marriage, arriving with the efficiency of a person who had somewhere to be. He was a solid, red-faced, determined infant who nursed with great concentration and slept with the same intensity, and Homer held him on the first night with a kind of careful wonder that Ida found more beautiful than anything she had ever seen. "He looks like he has opinions," Homer said. "Good," Ida said. "He should." The winter of 1874 to 1875 was a hard one, the kind of hard that Kansas could produce when it wanted to remind the people who lived on it that they were guests there on sufferance. 3 weeks of deep cold in January that killed 2 of Homer's cattle and froze the well pump solid, requiring Homer and Billy to spend 4 miserable mornings thawing it before it ran again. Ida managed Ellis through a winter cough that kept her up for 6 nights in a row, and Ruth Greenway came to stay for 2 weeks during the worst of the cold to help, and Ida was grateful enough for that help that she was a little ashamed of how hard she had worked for the previous year to manage without any assistance from anyone. She told Homer that one night when Ellis was asleep and the fire was banked for the night, that she thought she had spent too much energy proving she did not need help when the truth was that everyone needed help, and the real skill was in knowing when to accept it gracefully. Homer looked at her from across the fire, the lamplight warm on his face. "You needed to know you could do it alone first," he said. "I understood that. There is a difference between needing to prove it to yourself and being afraid to let anyone in. You were very patient about that," she said. "You were worth being patient about," he said simply. Ellis grew into a bright and energetic boy who had Ida's precise way of looking at things and Homer's quiet stubbornness, a combination that expressed itself primarily in a deep interest in where things came from, and an absolute refusal to be told something was impossible. By the time he was 18 months, he was following Homer around the yard with enormous seriousness, and Homer included him in whatever he was doing with a patience and delight that Ida watched from the doorway sometimes and felt something so warm it was almost painful. The spring of 1876 brought news from Missouri. Ida's sister Margaret wrote to say that her husband, the schoolteacher, had accepted a position at a new school in western Kansas, not far from Dodge City, and that they would be moving in the summer and would be only 40 miles from Millhaven. Ida read the letter twice and then went outside and told the tomato seedlings she was putting in for the season, which felt like a reasonable thing to do with very good news. Margaret and her husband John arrived in July of 1876 and made their way to Millhaven within a week of settling, and Ida stood in the road when she saw the wagon coming and felt a rush of something so fundamental she did not quite have a name for it. Margaret was 3 years older than Ida and looked like their mother, compact and brown-haired and quick-moving, and she jumped down from the wagon and they held onto each other for a full minute in the middle of the road without saying anything at all. Homer shook John's hand and they looked at each other with the careful assessment of men being evaluated as brothers, and something passed between them in the first 5 minutes of conversation that established a mutual respect, because they were similar kinds of men in their honesty and their practicality, and their shared pride in their capable wives. Margaret held Ellis and cried a little and told him he was enormous and beautiful, which he received with the calm of a 2-year-old who had always suspected these things about himself. Then she held Ida's hand and looked at the farm, at the wheat and the sunflowers and the solid barn and the south-facing garden that was running heavy with summer production, and she said, "You built this." "We built this," Ida said, meaning herself and Homer. "I know," Margaret said, "but you started it. You held it while you had to hold it alone, and then you chose what came next." Ida looked at her ring, the garnet set in gold that Eleanor had worn through everything, and the plain gold band beside it. "I had help," she said, "at a very useful moment." Margaret looked at Homer across the yard where he was showing John the north field and said, "I can see that." By 1877, the cattle herd had grown to 130 head, and Homer hired a second hand, a quiet older man named Hester who knew cattle the way some people knew language, intuitively and deeply. The northern grazing lease was renewed for 2 more years, and Homer was talking with some care about the possibility of purchasing the land outright if the opportunity presented itself. Ida put in a 3rd wheat field in the fall of 1877 and hired Ruth's nephew, a young man named Samuel Greenway who had just arrived from Iowa looking for work, to help manage the expanded planting through the harvest cycle. Samuel was 20 years old and hardworking, and a little lost in the way of young men far from home, and Ida paid him fairly and fed him supper on working days, and watched him grow into the work the way she had watched her own plants grow into the Kansas soil. Their second child, a girl they named Eleanor Margaret Ashford, arrived in February of 1878 in a winter storm that had come down fast and hard, and it was Agnes Kepler who arrived to help, because Agnes had helped birth half the children in the county by that point, and arrived at homesteads in need with the brisk competence of a woman who considered childbirth a practical matter, best handled by experienced and unflappable assistants. Eleanor Margaret came into the world in the middle of the night with a strong voice and a determination that had apparently been waiting impatiently for the exit, and Homer held her in the gray dawn after the storm had cleared, snow bright through the window, and looked down at this small new person with the same wonder he had had with Ellis, but this time also with a kind of settled gladness, as if the world had confirmed something he had already decided to believe in. "Eleanor," Ida said, "after my grandmother." Homer looked at the garnet ring on Ida's finger and then at the child and nodded. "Eleanor," he said, "that is right." Ellis, who was 3½ and had been kept at the Keplers overnight during the birth, was brought home the next morning by Herman Kepler, who held his hand down from the wagon with great ceremony, and stood in the doorway of the room looking at his sister with the intense evaluating expression of a small boy encountering a new and puzzling element in his previously comprehensible world. "She is very small," he said. "You were that small once," Homer told him. Ellis considered this and appeared to find it unlikely. Then he went over and very gently touched his sister's hand, and she immediately grasped his finger with the automatic grip of a newborn, and he looked up at his parents with eyes gone wide with something that was clearly significant to him. "She is holding on," he said. "She is," Ida said. He did not say anything else, but he sat beside the bed for a long time with his finger in his sister's grip, very still and serious, a small boy discovering what it meant to have something to protect. Millhaven grew through the late 1870s in the way that Kansas towns grew when they were situated right, when the cattle trails moved nearby and the railroad conversation started. By 1878, there were 2 new buildings on the main street and a second general store that provided some welcome competition to the existing one, and caused Gerald Stout to extend his credit lines with considerably less selectivity than he had previously managed, which Ida noted with a quiet satisfaction. She became, over those years, a central figure in the Millhaven community of women, not because she sought it, but because she was competent and fair-minded, and because people came to her with their practical problems, and she generally knew what to do about them. She helped Agnes Kepler organize a cooperative canning effort among 7 neighboring farms that let everyone put up more preserves than they could have managed alone. She wrote 2 formal letters of complaint to the county land office on behalf of a homesteading family, named the Parsons who had been given incorrect boundaries on their filing and were in danger of losing their claim, and she wrote the letters with such precision and documentation that the office corrected the error within a month. She helped Ruth Greenway draft a petition to the Millhaven School Board requesting an extended school term, because Ruth's nephew Samuel had married a young woman from town, and they had a child, and Ruth was determined that the children of the area would have a better school year than the current arrangement provided. The petition was successful, and the school term was extended by 6 weeks the following year. Homer watched all of this with a steady admiration that he expressed mostly by making sure she had the time to do it, by taking on tasks that freed her hours, by never making her feel that her work in the community was less important than the farm work. He told her once that she was the most effective person he had ever met, and she told him that was a very high compliment coming from him, and he said it was intended to be. In the spring of 1879, Homer received a letter from Texas. It was from his older brother, whose name was James, a man Homer had mentioned occasionally with a careful fondness that suggested a complicated relationship. James was in difficulty, a business failure in San Antonio that had left him with significant debt and few options, and the letter asked if Homer could take him on for a season, give him work until he could get back on his feet. Homer showed Ida the letter, and she read it and handed it back and said, "Of course he comes." Homer looked at her. "It might be complicated," he said. "James and I have not always been easy." "You are brothers," Ida said. "He is in trouble, you have work. That is the whole of it." Something moved in Homer's face that was relief and gratitude and love all running together. "All right," he said. James Ashford arrived in June, thinner than Homer's description had prepared her for, a man of 35 with Homer's dark eyes but a more restless energy behind them, a man who had made some wrong choices and knew it, and was not sure how to carry that knowledge. Ida fed him a solid supper on his first night and treated him with the same direct courtesy she extended to everyone, and by the end of the first week, she saw James beginning to lose some of the defensive wariness he had arrived with, because it is very difficult to maintain that particular tension around a woman who simply takes you at face value and expects you to behave accordingly. He worked hard. He knew cattle from a Texas background, and he and Billy and Hester made a solid crew, and Homer worked alongside them as he always did, not standing apart from the physical labor, which James observed with a respect he expressed by working equally hard. Ida watched the brothers in the evening sometimes, sitting on the porch or at the table after supper, talking in the easy shorthand of men who had grown up together, and she thought about her and Margaret, about the particular deep knowing of siblings, the way they could speak in incomplete sentences and still be fully understood. By fall, James had saved enough from his wages to pay off the most pressing part of his Texas debt, and was beginning to look like a man with a future he could see from where he was standing. He left in October with a handshake for Homer that lasted several seconds longer than was strictly necessary, and a hug for Ida that surprised them both a little, and told them he would come back when he had something to show for himself. He did come back, 3 years later, with a woman named Clara and a plan to start a small cattle operation of his own in a county over. And Ida cooked a grand supper for the occasion, and Homer and James talked past midnight about the specifics of the plan. And Ida and Clara sat together and discovered they got along well, which seemed to be the only possible conclusion to a story that had begun with a letter and a decent impulse. But that was later. In the fall of 1879, it was just the four of them again. Homer and Ida and Ellis, who was 5 and starting to read with a fierce concentration, and Alina, who was 19 months and had opinions about everything, including the order in which she wanted her meals served. And the farm settled into the harvest rhythm that Ida loved best, the satisfying completion of a year's work gathered in and stored against the winter. On the last evening of October, after the harvest was fully in and the accounts settled, and the winter preparation done, Homer and Ida sat on the porch in the last of the autumn warmth, the way they had taken to sitting together in the evenings when the children were asleep. The light was going down gold, and the prairie stretched out in every direction, vast and clean and theirs, and the creek valley caught the last of the color and held it for a long moment before the dark came. Homer had his arm around her shoulders, and she had her head tipped against him, and neither of them was talking, because some things required silence to be properly felt. She turned the ring on her finger, the garnet warm in the fading light, and thought about the morning 6 years ago when she had stood in front of Gerald Stout's counter with shaking hands and a grain problem and no options, and thought about how her grandmother's ring had sat in Stout's cash box for perhaps 40 minutes before Homer Ashford had walked in and seen it there, and decided without hesitation that this was not right. She thought about riding home with 3 sacks of grain on Patience's back, alone and grim and resolved, and then hearing hoofbeats and turning to see a stranger coming up the road with the ring held up in the April sun, and how her throat had closed entirely, and she had not known what to do with a kindness that large from a direction she had not expected. She thought about the lumber and the fence wire and the tomato seedlings and the jar of wild honey and the Sunday afternoons and the firefly evening at the gate and the plain gold band going on her finger in the Millhaven church in November of 1873, and Ellis's face when Alina grasped his finger, and Margaret standing in the road with her arms around her, and the way Homer looked at her still, after 6 years, as if she were something worth a serious and respectful attention. "Homer," she said, he said, which was how he said yes when he was comfortable. "You know that I think about that day in April sometimes," she said. "The day you rode up with the ring." "I know," he said. "Why did you really do it?" she asked. She had asked before once, and he had said because it was not right, and she had accepted that because it was true, but she was asking again, wanting the fuller truth. He was quiet for a moment, the way he got quiet when he was going to say something real. The last of the light lay gold along the creek. "I was coming into town to buy grain," he said. "Just a supply run, no particular feeling about the day. And then I walked into Stout's and I saw the ring sitting there, and Stout told me a widow woman had traded it for feed grain. And I looked at it and I thought, that ring belongs on someone's hand. Someone who keeps it on through everything, who kept it on through losing her husband and carrying a farm alone and all the kinds of mornings that takes. And I thought, whoever she is, she should have it back. Not because I knew you. I did not know you yet." He paused. "I think I bought it back because I believed you existed, because I thought there was a woman out there who deserved to get it back, and I wanted to be the person who made that happen." And then you turned around on the road and I saw your face and I thought, well, there she is. Ida sat very still in the circle of his arm and listened to the creak settling in the last light, and felt the ring warm on her finger, and thought that this was what her grandmother had meant. She understood it now completely. Gold remembered where it had been worn. Gold remembered every hand that had held it, and every hardship it had witnessed, and every love that had grown up around it. She tipped her head back and looked at Homer's face in the last gold light of October, the jaw she knew as well as her own hands now, the eyes that still looked at her with that serious, careful, attentive warmth, and she thought that the world had given her something extraordinary on the morning she had stood in Gerald Stout's warehouse and told herself she had no options. It had given her Homer Ashford, 6 miles away, going to town for grain, about to walk through a door. "I am glad you existed," she said. He pulled her closer and kissed the top of her head and looked out over the prairie that held their life, their cattle and their wheat and their sunflower rows and their children sleeping in the warm house behind them. "I am glad you let me back in," he said. She laughed softly. "You did not give me much chance to do otherwise," she said. "You showed up with lumber before I had finished thinking about it. I was not taking the risk of you deciding it was more sensible to be alone," he said. "It would have been more sensible," she admitted. "Yes," he said, "sensible is overrated." She laughed again, and they sat until the dark came fully down and the stars came out over the Kansas plain, brilliant and cold and countless, and the prairie settled into its night sounds. And behind them in the house Ellis slept with his books around him, and Alina slept with her small fists curled. And tomorrow would bring its work and its weather and its 1,000 ordinary demands, and all of it was theirs. The years that followed were full and textured and alive with the particular richness of a life, built honestly by two people who had each learned to stand alone before they chose to stand together. The wheat fields expanded to include a rotation that Homer and Ida had developed together, combining her knowledge of soil management with his eye for land use, and they produced reliable yields that let them save steadily, season by season, against the future. The cattle herd reached 200 head by 1882, and Homer began to talk about acquiring the northern land outright, and the conversation had a settled confidence to it that was the sound of a man who could see his goal from where he was standing. Ellis grew into an earnest and observant boy who could read at an extraordinary level by the age of 7, and who combined this gift with an intensely practical mind, the kind of boy who would read about plant biology and then go apply it directly to the garden beds with careful experimentation. Ida found this enormously satisfying, not because she pushed him toward it, but because she saw herself in the impulse, the need to understand things fully before deciding what to do about them. Alina grew into something else entirely, quick and physical and dauntless. A girl who climbed everything she could find to climb, and who had learned to ride a horse before she could reliably tie her own shoes, and who had Homer's steadiness at the center of her, and Ida's fire at the edges. A combination that Agnes Kepler, who adored her, said was absolutely going to be someone's problem in about 10 years, and said it with a great delight. A third child arrived in 1883, another boy they named Thomas, who was small and watchful at birth and grew into the kind of child who said very little but noticed everything, who could find any animal that had gone missing, because he seemed to think the way animals thought and knew where they would go, who was Billy's favorite because Billy recognized a certain quality of attention in him that he associated with good horsemen and good trackers. Billy himself had by this time been with them for 10 years and was as much a part of the Ashford household as anyone, and Ida had long since made it clear that his wages and his standing were not contingent on any grace or favor, but were simply owed to him as a skilled man who did skilled work and did it excellently. When a man in Millhaven made an ugly remark about Billy's presence at a town meeting in 1881, it was Ida who responded first, directly and without heat, explaining in plain terms that Mr. Vega was a valued member of the community, and that anyone who took issue with his presence was welcome to explain their reasoning to her and her husband in detail. And the combination of her directness and Homer's quiet presence beside her resulted in the man deciding he had nothing further to say. Billy had heard about this later and had thanked Ida with a formality that she understood was the deepest sincerity. And she had told him there was nothing to thank her for because she had only said what was true. And he had looked at her with a steadiness that told her he understood exactly what she meant, and that it mattered nonetheless. Ruth Greenway's nephew Samuel, who had started as a seasonal worker on the wheat harvest, had by 1884 become a fully established part of the Millhaven farming community with a wife and 2 children and land of his own. And Ida took a quiet pride in this that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with the satisfaction of having recognized good qualities in a young person and given them the space and fair treatment to develop. In the summer of 1884, Margaret and John came to visit for 2 weeks, and the house was full and noisy in a way that Ida had not known it could be, with John and Homer deep in conversation about soil and land use in the evenings, and Margaret and Ida talking in the kitchen in the mornings with the easy, endless conversation of sisters who had not had enough time together, and the children running through everything like a small, exuberant weather system. On the last night of the visit, Margaret and Ida sat up past midnight on the porch after everyone else had gone to sleep, and they talked about their parents and their childhood in Illinois and about Alina, their grandmother, the woman who had kept the ring through everything. She would have loved this place, Margaret said, looking out at the dark prairie. She would have complained about the wind, Ida said. She would have complained about everything and loved every minute of it, Margaret said, which was exactly true. Ida touched the ring on her finger. I almost lost it, she said. You know that, I almost gave it away for good. I know, Margaret said. You told me in a letter. The feed grain business. Homer brought it back before nightfall, Ida said. Margaret looked at her. That is a good way to say it. It is the only way to say it, Ida said. He went to town for grain and he came back with my grandmother's ring and 6 years of everything good that followed. Margaret reached over and took her hand, the hand with the ring, and held it. Ida, she said, are you happy? Ida looked out at the dark prairie and the bright stars, and thought about the wheat and the cattle and the children and Homer, sleeping inside with his arm across the empty space where she had been. She thought about tomato seedlings in clay pots, and a jar of wild honey tied with a bit of cord, and the sound of hoofbeats coming up behind her on the road to home. Yes, she said, genuinely and thoroughly, and not in spite of everything but because of it. Margaret squeezed her hand, and they sat together under the Kansas stars, 2 sisters from Illinois who had each built something real in the wide country, until the night went late enough that they had to go inside. Homer purchased the northern grazing land in the autumn of 1885, the culmination of 12 years of steady building that had started with 50 head and a good bull and a cabin on a rise above the creek. He came home from the land office in Millhaven with the deed in his hand and the expression of a man who has reached a thing he has been walking toward for a long time and finds it exactly as he thought it would be, not dramatic, not transformed, just solid and real and his. He showed the deed to Ida and she read it carefully, the way she read everything carefully, and then she looked up at him. Well, she said, there it is. There it is, he agreed. She put the deed on the table between them and covered his hand with hers. Your father would have been pleased, she said. He had told her about his father over the years, a tenant farmer in Texas who had never owned the land he worked, and had raised Homer with a particular emphasis on the importance of that distinction. Homer's hand turned under hers and held it. He would have been loud about it, he said, with the warmth of someone remembering something both painful and dear. Then we should be a little loud about it too, Ida said. Let us have the Keplers and Ruth and Samuel and his family and Billy for supper on Sunday. Let us celebrate properly. He looked at her. You would do that? It is worth celebrating, she said. You built this. We built this. Yes, Sunday supper. Sunday supper stretched into the evening, and the lamps burned late, and Sorrels was found and brought over with his fiddle, and the cleared barn floor served as a dancing space, and Herman Kepler laughed his large laugh, and Agnes told everyone who would listen that Homer and Ida Ashford were the finest neighbors she had ever had, which was the highest compliment available in her particular vocabulary. Ellis, who was 11, stood at the edge of the dancing with a composure that was entirely his father's, and watched the adults with observant eyes, already thinking about something, always thinking about something. Eleanor, who was 7, danced with the complete abandon of a person who has not yet been told to be self-conscious, and Thomas sat on Billy's knee and watched the fiddle with his quiet and total attention. Ida danced with Homer in the lamplight, just as she had danced with him in the same lamplight 11 years before on their wedding night at the Keplers' farm, and he still danced badly and still did not stop dancing anyway, and she still laughed at it, and the laugh was exactly the same as it had been the first time. "You have not improved," she said. "I have not tried to," he said. "I decided early on that you liked it." "I like that you do it anyway," she said. "That is what I said," he said, which made her laugh again. He held her closer and she went, easy and sure, in his arms, and around them the barn was full of light and music and people they had chosen and people who had chosen them back, and the children were alive with the evening, and the land was theirs in every direction for miles in the good Kansas night. She thought, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, about what the world looked like before it gave you the thing you did not know you were waiting for. About April and the shaking hands and the grain trade and the long ride home alone. About hoofbeats and a ring held up in the morning sun. About a plain, decisive voice saying it was not right and meaning it and acting on it. Gold remembered where it had been worn. It remembered every hand that had held it, every hardship it had witnessed, every love that had grown up alongside it. Ida Thatcher had kept it through 40 years of the frontier. Ida had kept it through the worst 8 months of her life and the crisis that followed. And Homer had seen it on a counter in a warehouse and known, without knowing anything else about her, that it belonged somewhere it had not been before. He had brought it back before nightfall. Everything that mattered had come from that. She turned her face up to him in the lantern-bright barn, and he looked down at her with his steady dark eyes, and everything between them was known and real and built from the ground up, honest stone by honest stone, through grief and work and argument and laughter and the 1,000 ordinary mornings of a life genuinely shared. "Homer," she said. "Ida," he said back. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The fiddle played on, and the night held them, and the prairie stretched out in all directions, wide and starlit, and full of the future they were still building, slowly and solidly and together. The way they built everything, the only way either of them had ever known how to build anything that was meant to last. Outside, the Kansas night was very old and very quiet, and somewhere down the creek valley, the water was running quick and cold over clean stone, and the garnet ring was warm on her finger, and Ida Thatcher, who was now also Ida Ashford and had been for 12 years, and intended to be for every year that followed, held onto her husband in the dancing light and was, without qualification or reservation or any remaining shadow of doubt, exactly where she was supposed to be.